The panel is here. NBC News senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett, Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and co-author of The Divider, Trump in the White House, and NBC News managing Washington editor Carol Lee. Thank you to all of you for being here for my very first Meet the Press. I am so honored to have all of you. I want to start off just by getting your takeaways of what we just witnessed. And Peter, I want to start with you. What's your big takeaway?
Yeah, I was struck by how defiant he is. Defiant of you, defiant of the system, defiant of facts, right? He's just a bulldozer shoveling falsehoods and lies throughout your interview, and you're fact-checking him all along the way. But he is creating a different reality that has been successful for him so far in leading the Republican nomination fight.
Yeah, and energizing his supporters, that's for sure. Carol, what was your big takeaway?
Well, on the legal stuff, the takeaway is, you can see why former President Trump has gone through a number of lawyers as he's seen these indictments and been investigated. And just politically speaking, big picture, he's very clearly running in a general election. He barely mentions his GOP rivals, and he focuses almost entirely on President Biden.
Yeah, it's a really great point. Laura, what was your takeaway? And we have a lot of legal stuff to pick through.
There were a lot of legal Easter eggs in there for us to chew on. But I have to say, I thought one of the more fascinating parts of that entire extended interview was what he refused to answer to you. And what he refused to answer is, what exactly were you doing in the dining room on January 6th?
Why do you think that is so significant, Laura? Let's start there before we delve into some of the other Easter eggs.
Well, I think for his lawyers, they would probably prefer that he didn't answer that, but there was so much that he was willing to go into, which is, for a criminal defense attorney, sort of the nightmare scenario. When you have these 4 criminal trials, which are a long ways off, there's plenty of time for him to talk and do sit-down interviews like this, and he's essentially boxing himself into positions that he doesn't need to without really knowing where these cases are going. And so when he tells you, you know who I listen to? Myself. That's coming when his attorneys are saying, at least previewing lines of defense, that he wants to be able to rely on his lawyers, no matter how misguided their advice was about trying to steal the election. When you say, I relied on myself, that is fodder for cross-examination.
Yeah, and let's just delve into that a little bit more deeply, because there was some wiggle room around the edges. But how significant was that moment, Laura?
I think that's a huge moment. And of course, he's saying now in a sit-down interview, months away from any of these trials, he's going to testify. I would be shocked if any attorney was going to endorse that view. But to say so definitively, I relied on my own instincts. That video is going to be replayed for a jury some way, somehow.
Peter, let me turn to you and bounce off of what Laura is saying, because, yes, he says he is willing to testify. I asked him about one of these charges in the Mar-a-Lago documents case, in which he is alleged to have directed a staffer to delete surveillance footage that shows boxes being moved around. He denies that off the bat, says he's willing to testify, but then tries to pivot to something that he's not accused of, which is deleting the video.
Yeah.
But he does say the actual charge is false. What did you make of that?
Yeah, I know, it's fascinating. There's a lot of evidence that Jack Smith has already presented in terms of testimony, messages, and so forth on this very question. It was part of a superseding indictment. So he is contradicting, his own staff, people who have talked to Jack Smith about it. But you're right. He's trying to say, well, look, if they were my tapes and I could have deleted if I wanted to, and I didn't delete them, as if somehow that gets them off the hook. If you direct somebody to do a crime, as Jack Smith is alleging, it doesn't matter whether they actually follow through on it. You actually committed a crime yourself under Jack Smith's theory.
Carol, you have a lot of reporting from inside the White House, their strategy there. The president is trying to keep his distance from these indictments, and yet some of his allies say at some point he's going to have to shift his strategy. How do you think the White House Democrats are processing all of this?
Well, what Democrats have told us over the course of the last several weeks and months is that as these indictments pile up and the president has made a very concerted decision that he's not going to weigh in publicly on them and that they're going to keep this distance there, the question that Democrats raise is whether or not voters are seeing that difference or seeing that distinction. And former President Trump is trying to make clear and make sure that they basically think these are Biden indictments, and President Biden doesn't want to weigh in. And the concern is that that's a real gamble, that politically, if the president is not challenging this and saying that his Justice Department is independent and out there really talking about it, then that cedes that ground to Trump, and he allows him to change voters' minds.
Peter, weigh in on this point? I mean, how risky is the strategy of keeping hands off and saying, hey, I'm going to stay focused on my campaign and my agenda and not talk about these
I think
indictments?
it's frustrating for Democrats. Liberals and progressives are upset that he's not weighing in. But Carol's right. There's nothing but danger ahead if he engages on that, because he looks like he's doing exactly what Trump is saying. Trump says to you over and over again, they're Biden indictments. There's no Biden indictment here. There's no evidence he has anything to do with this other than having appointed an attorney general, which is what a president does. But he would feed into that by looking like he was going after him and giving Trump the ammunition he wants.
Laura, it was notable that the former president took aim at Jack Smith, special prosecutor who's charged him, and then I believe
called him a lunatic.
Called him a lunatic, which we've heard him say before. And then a day later, Judge Chutkin issued a request for a narrow gag order. So within that context, it doesn't seem like he's changing his rhetoric at all. I mean, talk about the significance of that issue and his ongoing attacks against the prosecutor.
So he's not changing his rhetoric at all, but I can tell you prosecutors are zeroing in on interviews like this one, mining them for things like that, because they're trying to say, look, not only is there a security risk for the witnesses and the prosecutors, the judge herself who has received threats, but they're saying it has the ability to taint the ability to have a fair trial. And so that's why they're asking the judge for a narrow gag order that would not stop him from talking at all. You couldn't do that. But what they do want is for the judge to say, you cannot talk about the witnesses or make threats against anyone during the course of this trial. We'll see what she does. I think she's probably unlikely to do that in the first instance, but she may haul him in and scold him again. We've already seen her do it once, and she may do it again.
Yeah, it just adds to the potential risk of the legal peril swirling around him. Speaking of that, Peter Baker, another revelation here. We had reporting around this, but he acknowledges for the first time, yes, there were conversations about him potentially pardoning himself in his final days in office. It's not clear if he has the authority to do that, so that would be untested. But what did you make of that revelation?
Well, it's fascinating because it shows that they understand that he, in fact, was in criminal exposure, that he had exposed himself criminally, potentially, and that there might be a need for a pardon. You don't talk about pardoning yourself if you haven't done anything. And they understood in those final crazy days of the White House when things were very volatile, very tempestuous, and he'd just been impeached for the second time. And it suggests, of course, an understanding of just how exposed he was.
And I do want to talk about the other legal issue we've been tracking throughout this week. Hunter Biden indicted on gun charges. Carolyn, you have some new exclusive reporting out of the White House on that.
That's right, Kristen. What people close to the president have been telling us over the last several weeks is that, you know, this is a very sensitive issue. Obviously, it's a family issue. Very few people talk to the president about his son, only a couple of aides, and only when they have to. Now, politically speaking, what people close to the president say is they're not worried that voters are going to look at this and say, oh, Hunter Biden was indicted. I'm not going to vote for President Biden. What they are worried about is the emotional toll that this takes on the president and how that plays out politically, meaning he's distracted. It's weighing on him heavily. And that creates a scenario in which the president is more prone to missteps and mistakes, the type that he cannot afford to make because Republicans will seize on them, because voters are evaluating whether or not the president, given that he's 80 years old, is competent to serve another term. And so it's very fraught, it's very sensitive, and there are a lot of concerns.
Yeah, well, and one of the other issues looming over all of this is something that I talked to the former president about, the issue of abortion. And Laura, before we get to the politics of it, legally, as I raised with him, there are a number of cases that are being brought throughout the country, women and doctors saying that their lives are being put at risk now that Roe is overturned. Just set the legal landscape for us.
Right. So I think the former president's most enduring legacy, perhaps at least one of them, will be putting 3 Supreme Court justices on the nation's highest court that struck down Roe. And there's a piece of him that seems to take pride in that and to use that to trumpet his position. But there's another piece of him that seems to realize sort of the peril of that position and kicking it back to the states. As he said, he sort of couched it as everybody was okay with that. Everybody was not okay with that, because the natural output of that means that states can put in place highly restrictive rules, which result in people even having medical issues and still not being able to obtain an abortion.
And politically speaking, this is such a complex and complicated issue. And Carolee, another complex and complicated issue that we're going to be watching, obviously, foreign policy. And you heard the president there not say that Ukraine's security is linked to the U.S. He declined to say that. And he didn't say if he would send troops into Taiwan if China were to invade. And I know you also have a little bit of reporting on that as well this morning.
Right. And first, I just want to fact check a couple of things that the president said on Ukraine. It's not true. The U.S. spends much more than the president, or much less than the president said, the former president said, and Europe spends much more than the president said. And on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a natural gas pipeline from Russia to Germany, that was already largely completed by the time President Biden took office, and that the decision on whether or not that goes forward is Germany's, obviously. So there's that. And on China, what we've learned this morning is that the President Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, has been secretly meeting over the weekend in Malta, a third-party European country, with the Chinese foreign minister. And that's significant because this is seen as a precursor to a meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping later this fall.
Fantastic new reporting there. Big picture, Peter Baker. I'm giving the final word to you. We have gotten criticism for just sitting down with former President Trump. He is the former president. He's facing 4 indictments as journalists. Just set the scene, the backdrop, why there is still news value, and value for the public to hear from him.
Well, this is a huge challenge for American journalism, of course, right? It cannot be that a person can run for President of the United States, be a front runner in his party, and possibly win without ever being challenged by a tough, independent interviewer. And that's, I think, an important part of our system. Now, it obviously is a challenge for us because he is just going to spout out one thing after another, and fact-checking in real time is a real hard thing. But what you've done here is edit it and make sure people understand what's real and what's not.
I cannot thank you all enough for being here. Laura, Peter, and Carol, thank you.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.